É uma imensa honra, uma satisfação imensa para o Instituto dos Advogados do Paraná receber os senhores hoje, o professor Kanayama, a professora Melina Fachin, com essa belíssima obra, tradução da obra do professor Tsesis. Para nós, é o cumprimento de uma função institucional, mas, acima de tudo, é uma oportunidade incrível para aprendermos com os senhores. Então, professora Melina, nossos mais sinceros agradecimentos. Professor Kanayama, pela organização e por prestigiar todos os estudantes, nós, brasileiros, com essa tradução, esse trabalho belíssimo, feito com diversos coautores, muitos dos quais estão aqui presentes e nós também cumprimentamos. Então, aos senhores pesquisadores, a nossa gratidão. Eu vou transmitir à professora Melina a presidência dos trabalhos, agradecendo também a paciência do professor Tsesis conosco, com o nosso atraso e com os nossos problemas técnicos.
Boa noite a todas, boa noite a todos. Good night, Alex. Always a pleasure to see you. And if you excuse me, I will just address the audience in Portuguese before giving you the floor. Eu gostaria de fazer um registro muito especial antes de passar a palavra ao professor Alexander Tsesis, que é uma palavra de reconhecimento e de agradecimento. Essa é uma obra que foi gestada dentro do programa de pós-graduação da Universidade Federal do Paraná, e é uma honra termos a nossa coordenadora do PPGD aqui, professora Vera Carandichoeire. É uma obra que foi pensada num espaço público, né, com todas as dificuldades que a universidade pública encontra, mas produzindo trabalhos de qualidade, de relevância e de quilate como esse. Então, a primeira palavra de agradecimento é ao nosso programa de pós-graduação, né, e a possibilidade de produzirmos pesquisa de qualidade, né, que só o espaço público, de fato, pode aí nos propiciar desta maneira. O segundo registro de gratidão é o professor Rodrigo Kanayama, amigo, parceiro de muitas frentes na Universidade Federal do Paraná, e que topou, né, junto comigo, essa disciplina, que foi uma disciplina também, né, pensada coletivamente no PPGD da Universidade Federal do Paraná, para trabalhar, né, com uma obra na língua inglesa, no intuito e nos esforços aí que estamos cada vez mais de internacionalização do nosso programa, e que chegou ao resultado de traduzir as ideias do professor Tsesis para o português. Então, Rodrigo, muito obrigada por essa e por todas as outras parcerias. E também agradecer a todas as alunas e a todos os alunos da disciplina, que são os coautores e as coautoras dessa obra, né? Sem ela, obviamente, a obra não teria se materializado. Foi um esforço coletivo, né? Uma obra que penso bem comum, feita coletivamente, portanto, faz todo sentido que assim o seja. Então, deixar a nossa palavra de gratidão a cada uma das autoras e dos autores que nos conduziu aí nesse caminho que não foi fácil. Traduzir uma obra não é uma atividade fácil, né, porque nós temos, além da diferença do próprio pensamento, né, da common law para a civil law, há também um conjunto muito específico de ideias que torna desafiador fazer isso. Foram muitas leituras e releituras, né, professor Rodrigo, mas chegamos a esse resultado final que nos honra, né, alegra aí imensamente a todas e a todos que participaram da obra. E a última palavra de gratidão é especialmente ao professor Alex. As ideias sobre o ethos constitucional, talvez quando nós lançamos a disciplina, nós não tínhamos ideia do quanto elas seriam importantes nos anos subsequentes. Pensar se existe um espírito subjacente na nossa teoria constitucional, na nossa história constitucional brasileira, que, né, seja capaz e resiliente aí de passar e sobreviver, né, a tantos desafios e tantas rupturas, né, se provou fundamental. Saímos aí dos últimos anos, né, com desafios imensos ao nosso projeto constitucional, mas o nosso projeto constitucional sobreviveu. E essa talvez seja a maior prova de que nós temos, de fato, um ethos, um espírito constitucional calcado na tríade que a nossa Constituição nos deu, que é a defesa da democracia, a solidificação do Estado de Direito e a defesa dos direitos humanos. Mas o que é importante remarcar, e acho que a fala do professor Alex Tsesis vai deixar isso bastante claro, que como a Constituição, o ethos também é, né, um elemento vivo que não necessariamente significa ou se traduz no texto da Constituição apenas, e ele é, sobretudo, o reflexo daquelas e daqueles que fazem a Constituição e daquelas e daqueles que precisam da Constituição para sua proteção. Né? Reside aí, né, o maior significado e também a maior importância de termos, identificarmos, né, um espírito da nossa Constituição. Então, dito isso, de modo muito breve, queria também, por fim, agradecer ao Instituto dos Advogados, que nos recebeu aqui, abrindo, né, essa casa e honrando a tradição do Instituto dos Advogados, que é de pensar a cultura jurídica paranaense. E passo a palavra para escutarmos, então, o professor Alex Tsesis. Thank you again, Alex, for being with us, for allowing us to rethink your ideas in Portuguese, and for addressing us a few words today about your work about constitutional ethos. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much for having me here, and I am deeply grateful, obviously, first and foremost to Professors Rodrigo Kanayama and Melina Fachin. They're wonderful colleagues. I've heard them speak in English, which has been a tremendous honor, and have read them in Portuguese, even though my Portuguese is somewhat limited. But I thought the translation was beautifully done, and I am so grateful to all of you, the entire team that worked on it. I can see you in the audience, so just to say my gratitude, and maybe you can raise your hands because I'd love to know you. Professor Vera is there also. Thank you so much for being in the audience. But I am grateful to these people as well. Amardillo Leal, Bruno Merinho, Danilo Arnott. Oh, thank you for raising your hand. Thank you so much. Gabriel Tomás. Gustavo Scandelari, Herminio Neto.
It's there.
Oh, great. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Caroline Santos. Oh, thank you so much. Luis Augusto Silva. Luis, I think maybe we've met before. I'm not sure, but Mariano Garcia. Oh, thank you. Melino Brito. There you go. Thank you very, very much. Nicolo Olchanovsky and Olivio Saldana. Oh. And Renta Trajan, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very, very much. And Thiago Zagato. I know I mispronounced your names. I apologize, but I'm doing my best. And so I'm very, very grateful to you for the amount of time that you've spent with me, and of course for the University of Paraná and the Center of the Study of the Constitution and the Institute for Attorneys in Paraná. And thanks for the rest of you as well for being here in the audience for this starting off of this translation, even though I also had the opportunity to spend time with Melina and Rodrigo in the Chicago just this last November. Let me begin. I'm going to speak in more general terms. I want to begin by speaking about the general principles of the book, then move on to some comparative thinkers, other legal philosophers who have thought in this area, and then finish up with that. So constitutional law consists of principled and textual components. You'll apologize if I speak too quickly. I'm going to try not to. I know that English is Well, you're all excellent in English. It's not your first language. So I hope that I will not be too quick, but somebody raise a hand and tell me to slow down if need be, okay? So there are principled and textual components, which I think is absolutely critical for any interpretation of the Constitution. That is to say, constitutional interpretation cannot be solely based on subjectivity, what we think of in our own selves, and yet text is just too narrow. It cannot be the be all and the end all, even with a long constitution as you have in Brazil, and certainly not with a constitution that is as sparse as the one we have in the United States. So in the U.S. Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution gives a very brief, principled explanation of what the purpose is of the government. And then we have the Declaration of Independence, which is a very interesting document because technically speaking, the Supreme Court does not use it as a source of interpretation. And yet it's read every Independence Day, July the 4th, and people talk about it in schools, and it's certainly part of our constitutional culture. So I think that those two things really form the basis in the United States of principled constitutionalism. The preamble to the Constitution, the preamble is the introductory paragraph, and the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Declaration was really created 13 years before the Constitution. So we have the Constitution in, or even 11 years, 1787, and then the Declaration 1776. The principles also come in through the Reconstruction Amendments. The Reconstruction Amendments in the United States are ones that were ratified into the U.S. Constitution after the Civil War. They're the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which has principles of equality for people, principles of procedural justice, and a variety of other provisions, and then the 15th Amendment, which begins the road to expanding elective franchise to people without racial discrimination, and then of course extends to women all the way in 1920, and then also with age, which comes in a later component of the Constitution. But all of these protect inalienable rights, and I believe are based on inalienable rights for the common good. Now, why is that controversial? To me, of course, it doesn't sound very controversial because it's in my mind. But for any legal philosopher, it would be really very controversial because most legal philosophers either take the perspective that law is based on protection of rights, what we call deontology, Kantianism, right? Or that it's utilitarian, that sort of Bentham school, where I'm trying to merge and combine or to synthesize both, to say that the principle of Constitution has to be based on the protection of inalienable rights for the common good. And that's a very controversial move that really there are very few people that make that move, even though it's easy to say, more difficult to prove. So social contract is only legitimate when it recognizes the equal common entitlements. Legitimate uses of authority must be balanced with the ability of equal individuals to pursue their own interests, but also seek the collective interest of the polity. That model is not dependent on positive law, and I'll get to that later on, but exists with certain aspirational and principled conjectures. To be legitimate, lawmaking must benefit the general welfare. The central norm of representative democracy prohibits arbitrary uses of power in violation of inalienable human dignity. While principle establishes consistent fundamental standards for rational advancement, the ideal must be broad enough to inspire activism as well as politicians, right? So when we talk about the people as having a place in government, much of that has to be how the people aspire, what they think of their constitution, what the benefits they think will be to themselves, to their families, and to those that follow them, to those that will exist in our political systems long after we are gone. The reality is that society's marches are often unsteady, they're inconsistent, they get off of the straight path, and that serves for all sorts of problems. So aspiration is critical for ending sexism, racism, xenophobia, bigotry, all these evils of society. Abstract principles then create a broadly stated obligation on government. They're things that the people can hold the government accountable for, and that the people can expand through representation, not only in government, but also in the way that they think of justice, equality, legal constraints, impartiality, but the way that they come down not only through government, but also in the how shall I say it, in the people of, in the constitution or association of groups, right? So it's not just government in whom we represent by having them in Congress or in Parliament, but also those people who make smaller groups, activists, NGOs, and so on. Government's many functions come from not only these very broad things, but things that occur on a daily basis: mail delivery, administration of public welfare. But they all must adhere to this abstract principle of constitutional government. Government agencies create and enforce laws, while social groups and individuals informally help and push their formation. Clauses of the Constitution are, for the most part, general. And now that's, I mean, I understand, of course, both with the Brazilian Constitution and the Indian Constitution, there's much more specificity. But nevertheless, there's an evolution of an understanding even of the linguistic construct, the words that are used in our constitutions. Most clauses require much interpretation, and that includes the clauses that create the structures of government: the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. Abstractions then create the possibilities and also tremendous uncertainties. Without recognized constitutional ideals, power is easily abused in the name of pragmatism, in the name of necessity, emergency. Norms of governments must be based on simple human inclinations. Desires change over time and over space. They vary between groups, and they are distinct to individuals. On the other hand, relying on text is also insufficient, since it too can be done in a manipulative way. It looks like formalism, but politicians can use these words in very contradictory manners, in manners that they really undermine the ideals that society has from the beginning and has developed through time. The wording of the Constitution should be rather understood in context, in the development of culture, in the evolution of society. Most of its provisions are meant to create broad principles of powers of government. The text sets general mandates, but all public officials must apply its significance to unique sets of domestic and international circumstances. Judges are additionally empowered to safeguard the system of legislative and executive misinterpretations. The reality, though, is that judges are also prone to error and sometimes act in very political ways. So one of the most complicated questions in constitutional law is whether or not the judge's decision-making, especially the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, should be final, or whether there should be supermajorities, that is to say, whatever we construct them, 3/4 majority, 2/3 majority of the parliamentary branch, of the legislative branch, to override it. Should that exist, or should we simply trust in judges? I'm not going to have much time to enter it, but it's really a major question that must be addressed in our writings about the Constitution. The constitutional maxim or principle creates a dual obligation to individuals and collective justice. If it empowers representative institutions to pass, enforce, and adjudicate general laws for the needs of a pluralistic culture. Obviously, the construction of maxim constitutionalism or constitutional ethos is accountable, but and should be predicated and should be enforceable against those in public office. But we must recognize that personalities certainly affect legislation, the enforcement of law, and the adjudication of decision making. The constitutional ethos limits the extent to which individuals can advance their preferences. The Constitution provides the point of convergence for the people with different goals. And let me explain that. I mean, by convergence, I mean that it creates a common vocabulary, a legal linguistic, a rhetoric for us to be able to find common mutual voice, common mutual interest. When we have political loggerheads, we find some commonality, something that's useful for us all. Even in matters of local concern, I'm thinking about things that are, regional, municipal, county, even school districts. The national norms set standards against discrimination targeting insular minorities. In the United States, perhaps the greatest achievement in this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was passed during the height of the civil rights era in the United States during Lyndon Johnson's administration, which, amongst other things, prohibited discrimination in places like hotels, restaurants, workplaces, and schools. I'm sorry, it's my telephone. Let me shut that off. Cooperation expands the effects of public action. Each agent must cooperate in the production of the best consequences possible, given the behaviors and non-cooperation. Commonly shared principles of action increase the ability of diverse groups to work together in complex social matters. Well-functioning society addresses the reasonable demands of people without making arbitrary distinctions. Otherwise, the will of a few would undermine the reasonable expectation of targeted members of the population. Laws and norms that facilitate interactions are most likely to be effective when they appeal to the rational interests of ordinary people. Most people who think of constitutional principle don't think of the provisions, the technical provisions of the Constitution, right? That's for us as lawyers, as scholars. But most people, they think of ideals, right? And it's up to us to instantiate them, to make them flesh and bone. Divergent views require rational thinking for the exercise of legitimate state power. Collective flourishing, then, has two components. The first is the acceptance of the dignity as a natural facet of all persons, irrespective of their backgrounds, talents, physical attributes, and preferences. This perspective is quite different from the purely empirical outlook, such as the one that's undertaken by H.L.A. Hart, which he describes social rules without adequately accounting for normative foundations of the rule of law. And the second component of community is community prosperity, which appears at the organizational level. It concerns the second component, organization, concerns methods of developing, applying, enforcing, and changing binding rules. As I mentioned earlier in this book, which I'm so grateful for you for translating and for you reading, Constitutional Ethos, I argue that the dual layering of this framework, individual and collective, is the only alternative really for general welfare. As I say, this is something that exists in the preamble and the Declaration of Independence in the United States. Positive justifications for developing institutional structures, procedures, administration, adjudication derives from cognizant people's facility to choose alternatives and to participate in positive and popular constitutionalism. Its negative analog is the limitation on authority. that prohibits officials from using arbitrary power to interfere with persons' judgments for what is best, for what their interests is, for what their loves are, for what their preferences are, and so on. And while the negative one deters and remedies wrongs, negative power of government is coupled with its more controversial compatriot, positive government obligation in matters of subsistence. The public and the private are interwoven, as that absent familiar basic services, fire, police, medical, whatever, the individual is unable to realize their expectations. So there's a positive requirement in government, and that is to say services, and a negative one, those things that cannot be done in order to maintain even-handedness. Constitutional maxim or ethos sets the overall structure of fairness, the requirement that all policies treat individuals equally as only legitimate means for achieving the common good. Individual rights are interwoven into community of equals. Take, for instance, legal rules of contract law. Those define the boundaries for productivity, reliability, joint ventures, gain, as well as confidence that my promises will lead to my being able to achieve something, to gain something back. Cumulatively, then, this contract law amounts to a free market. Without rules requiring parties to fulfill terms they legally enter into, people would be unwilling to risk making arrangements. This, in turn, would be a negative impact on the economy. Other constitutional provisions, like those that are collective and are public-privately meaningful. Freedom of speech, obviously something even more grand than contract law, guarantees representative government. It's essential for it. It's clearly necessary for the collective benefit, for deliberation, but it's also essential for personal fulfillment, right? So there's two things going on here. Freedom of the press, which is likewise protected by free speech, serves to inform informative functions of disseminating knowledge to a community and to transcend the current political climate. A free press allows journalists to follow their career ambitions, that's individual, and to spread ideals, critical self-government, collective, explore their own creativity, and it enables the audience to see the horizon, the far reaches, what's beyond that which exists in our legal culture today. As a Supreme Court justice in the United States once said, an informed public depends on accurate and effective reporting of the news media. Likewise, the ability to spread one's views through the press opens avenues for individuals to voice concerns and opinions, to express anger, spread joy, agony, affinity, and rejection. This is especially the case in the age of the internet. So many people have become really journalists, right, in our time. It's much different than the institutional press as it existed all the way up until the mid-1990s, and it continues to expand. And yet there's so much disinformation that we all must be cognizant of. And one of the most difficult problems, obviously, in our own times is how to deal with this disinformation, which in the United States was very true during President Trump's time, when it was impossible to check for average people statements that were absolutely disingenuous, not true, and drove policymaking in a manner that often took democracy off the rail. But ultimately, society is by the people, for the people, and so speech and press freedoms, just like contract ones, are personal and collective in a liberal democracy. Laws that on their face prohibit the perpetration, the execution of acts against individuals, be they racial or gender minorities, are ones that have to be suppressed in the negative sense, but also advanced for the common good in a positive sense. Laws that prohibit workplace discrimination against people based on race, sex, religion, and so on expand the talent pool, right? So we have, again, the protections for the individuals, but also for the benefit of the common good. It's interwoven, not separable. Additionally, laws that prohibit discriminatory public funding enable students, businesses, and public places of leisure, hotels, inns, restaurants, and so on, to advance their potential. People sit around, we talk to each other over bread, we chat, we communicate, and all of that has to be done in an atmosphere without discrimination based on arbitrary status, for the protection of dignity, but also for the advancement of social good. The ability to pursue happiness as a member of a legal culture whose aim is to advance a community of equals. For the minimal conditions, I mean, some of this has to do with John Rawls, but I won't have time to go into that, right? How we would want to do behind a veil of ignorance, what we would do and what sort of society we would build if we were unaware of it. But going beyond Rawls and not being so deontological, so duty, so individually based, to something that's much broader for society as a whole. The minimal conditions of fairness can only be met where there's some sort of assumption of an ideal that is created for civil liberties that allows parties to express themselves and to call others to effectuate the political process. A mechanical application of rules, which I think is the problem of Hart in trying to explain just positive law, is inadequate because it doesn't get at the nuances. On the other hand, without any core principles, utilitarian calculations are likely to be mistaken. They're whimsical. I mean, there's all sorts of problems with how do you calculate what in fact is the greatest benefit, especially if it means the suppression of certain individuals. While officials must answer to the public, they need not pursue their constituents' every desire. That is to say, you can't expect them to fulfill every will and every wish of the people, right? So the people too have to be governed, and that governance and that limitation comes from this constitutional ethos. Elections bring a new cadre of leaders into office without fresh ideas. They cannot entirely overturn, let me say that again. It brings fresh faces into the leadership, but they cannot function without ideals because they can't overturn existing order entirely or too quickly because the people simply won't accept it. To avoid instability, public voices must be given access to political debate, including effective channels of communication and representative democracy. Holding government actors accountable requires constitutional codification of norms and positive injunctions, positive commands, positive regulations, laws, statutes, ordinances, and so on. Knowing that existing laws and conventional rules is necessary for seeking modifications and wholesale change. And that's, of course, why we as attorneys are there to give advice, to give counsel. The utility of specific policy can only be determined through frank debate, empirical study, and statistical modeling, all of which rely on public knowledge of existing orders, proposals, and past practices. Personal interest, now I'm going to talk a little bit about personal interests and social ends. The United States Constitution is founded on the principle that people formed a union for the organization of institutions and for the protection of rights, whose ultimate purpose is the betterment of the whole. In a society of equals, officials in all three branches of government often grapple with how to complete the claims, and they often encounter complete impasses, complete disagreements amongst them. Unfortunately, politics and personal interests often prevail over public interest. Resolution should rather remain true to the fundamental ideals even as it aims for beneficial consequences. That is to say, I'm sorry because it's so technical, the ideals must remain in place even as society seeks to achieve betterment. That's an easier way of saying that. Purely pragmatic deliberation, that is to say, purely thinking of what can we do, risks under enforcing these commitments. And that's true in contract law as much as it is in free speech law. So presentist political benefits are just not enough. The constitutional ethos I have proposed in this book that's so kindly translated by Professors Melina and Rodrigo are based not entirely on natural law, and this is something Melina has written about in her work. It's because natural law still must be interpreted. Its textual bases in the United States are the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution. Yet those documents do not, and indeed they could not possibly create rights intrinsic to humanity. Instead, they guarantee those against encroachments, majoritarian tyranny, and arbitrary abuses of power. Abuses of constitutionalism are visible throughout the world today. In the United States, we have what might again, and might unfortunately, from my perspective, have Donald Trump for president, which I very much hope won't happen. But there's been a stepping back of democracy throughout the world. In Poland, with President Duda, in Mexico with AMLO, and in countries like Cameroon, Burundi, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Egypt. All of these are governed by strong presidents that have eliminated term limits. So in the text, they've eliminated them or ignored them entirely. But that doesn't change the ideals necessary for the common benefit of the people. The U.S., these ideals I've mentioned occur in these two sources. But apart from the authoritative texts, there are the people who to hold authoritarian leaders to account for the undermining of fundamental rights. And here I'm thinking about things like not only just voting, which seems to be the most obvious in a democracy, but also even just travel as essential for humans to be able to get around and to communicate with one another in order to secure their rights against majoritarianism, where the majorities oppose minority rights, and authoritarian tyrannies. Wedding the rule-based and ends-oriented analysis in matters of policy is not simply a theoretical exercise. It should be consciously pragmatic in its search for better outcomes. Affected individuals must be taken into account, but so too the welfare of the whole of the population. Private concerns are not absolutes, but neither are pragmatic ones. In the United States, since the New Deal, the Supreme Court has helped the country make significant strides to defining rights. But it's unbelievable. In the United States, and maybe this is a little bit too technical, so you'll excuse me, I won't say much on it, but we have a clause in the Ninth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the Ninth Amendment, but it's ignored by the U.S. Supreme Court. They just simply say it has no value. But this Ninth Amendment, if you look back at it, is the unenumerated rights clause. It says that even if a right is not enumerated, is not listed in the U.S. Constitution, the people still retain it. But the Supreme Court simply reads it out of the Constitution. It says it has no value. Justice Scalia was the chief proponent of this, just complete, nullity of a written text of the Constitution. So the court has, in the United States, increasingly understood the provisions of abstract statements to protect entitlements, but it's interpreted in a way that is very Eurocentric. The entitlements of inalienable rights rather exist in the second paragraph of the Declaration, the protection of individuals' born rights, what each of us is born, what's inalienable, what we might say is intrinsic to human dignity, that exists and is stated in the Declaration of Independence. But that too, the court has said does not have the ordinary constitutional value, something I think is very, very unfortunate. This has provided guidance to the country, and what's amazing is while the court ignores these abstractions, the people do not. Feminists, gay and lesbian rights activists, rights of people with race have adopted these terms, these ideals of the Constitution, despite the technicalities of the court. From its inception, the United States has grappled with civil rights. The interpretive process of the interpretation of the Constitution requires institutions to evolve in their understanding of how these objective standards of equality, of the common good, apply in issues that come up, gay marriage, abortion, and so on in the United States. We're grappling with this really significantly in the United States today, where the court has taken, I'm sure you know the term, of the originalist standpoint. More and more the court says that the Constitution has to be interpreted through history and tradition and text. But if you look at the cases, and I'm sorry I don't have time to go into them today, you're probably glad because you've got lots of things to do this afternoon, but so many of the cases, the court uses formalism to interpret these ancient constitutional principles. It says that it's doing no more than looking at history, but often there's no history at all in its interpretation, and it ignores what Lon Fuller in the United States long ago spoke of in terms of the norms of the Constitution. So, Melina, should I continue? I don't want to hold people up when we started late. I have more to say, but I can also stop here. You tell me.
For us, you can go,
Alex. I can't hear you.
No. No.
For us, hear me.
Será que tá?
No.
Oh.
I have more to say, but I can also stop.
Yeah.
You tell me. I don't want to take up
For us, we would like to hear you until tomorrow, Professor.
Yeah.
You said we had other things to do, but we have absolutely nothing more important or interesting to do. So please go on.
That I don't believe. I saw people drinking wine before. So a glass of wine. Don't feel inhibited. Just get up and if there are hors d'oeuvres, then eat a couple for me, please. All right, so I'll continue. So thus far, I've tried to demonstrate that there are general principles of government, and that the United States embodies these in the Declaration and the preamble, and that these establish this constitutional ethos which concerns individual and public good. While the constitutional ethos is stable in terms of principle, its details vary and are reworked by social movements, judicial opinions, the very statutes that are passed, popular culture, and a host of other deliberative channels. Put in more general terms, constitutional ethos is a principle that empowers individuals to flourish by pursuing their unique life quests while also maintaining coercive standards for government to advance policies that are likely to achieve collective goods. Constitutional ethos does not envision agreement on contentious constitutional topics. It simply can't, because that's where the individual comes in, and the collective cannot force its will on that individual where matters of constitutionalism are involved. To the contrary, conflicting views are not only to be expected, but are welcome in a vibrant and a pluralistic society. Indeed, governments should encourage public debate and solicit input from people within a wide range of perspective. It sounds so obvious, but I was born in the Soviet Union. I don't have any accent, but I was born in the Soviet Union. So for me, it has incredible significance, the ability to communicate ideas in a pluralistic society that allows for the exploration of rational views in order to prevent acts of intolerance. Laws enforced by statutes, executive orders, administrative law, and so on and so forth, have a dual justification. They must comport, they must abide by constitutional norms and provide clear notice to pertinent parties about what is legal and what type of behavior is allowable. Institutional actors authorized to weigh differing interests in the effective execution and the creation of law are authorized to place reasonable limits on people in their exercise of their wills. In turn, constitutional ethos along structural constraints places limits on what is justifiable use of authority. No branch of government is empowered to substitute its will against fundamental constitutional norms. Any of the branches of government must abide by these individual liberties. The ideal is not primarily discursive, as Jürgen Habermas claims, and here Dean Vera has written quite a bit on this, nor is it linguistic, as Richard Hart describes it, but is securely ethical. Let me try to explain this. Habermas writes convincingly that normative content of moral laws is derived from rational discourse, and that this leads to the development and the formulation of valid norms. And while dialogue is indeed indispensable to the construction of value theory, rational discourse is not enough. It cannot lead to the exercise of democratic norms by itself. Even tyrannical regimes find rational argument to support claims for self-aggrandizement. I'm sorry, again, a little bit too technical. Even authoritarian governments can find linguistic ways to explain away their tyranny. That's maybe the easy way to say it. Dehumanization, for instance, has historically been a common rationalization for group exclusion. People say they are not human. In Rwanda, that is to say, the Hutus would say the Tutsis are cockroaches. In Nazi Germany, they would say Jews are parasites. All of these are linguistic. And so there has to be an ideal that transcends language. A normative anchor is necessary against which discourse can be tested. Discrimination and prejudice are wrong, even if popular prejudices and discourse lean in that direction. The self-understanding and impartiality of democracies, of which Habermas writes, is not dependent on discourse alone, but the dignity of each person and the need for structuring mutually beneficial systems of laws. Many decisional directions can positively impact representative democracy. The extent to which politicians should take into account particular suggestions must be judged on a case-by-case basis, of course, but also based on the principles of governments. Rule of law will certainly be undermined by an approach that uses arbitrary means and standards and unjustified favoritism for a group or for groups of individuals. Constitutional theory should provide both a stable principle for respecting individuals, but also a dynamic means of advancing cultural norms, right? So, so much gay rights and equality is something that has advanced culturally in a way that even those of us who were born 30, 40, 50 years ago could not have envisioned at that time, and could not have really envisioned, if we are honest with ourselves, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. This notion of objectivity differs from that of legal positivists, and I spoke of H.L.A. Hart just a little while ago, who regard the law to only be the embodiment of actual norms, positive law, rather than universal standards. This is, again, besides H.L.A. Hart, just to mention another great giant of thought is, of course, Joseph Fraz holds this theory. Law is valid by virtue of social facts rather than some external moral rationale. In his famous debate with Hart, Lon Fuller pointed out that the oppressive institutions of totalitarian regimes like the Nazi government in Germany demonstrated the need for criticism based on values that are external to culturally accepted norms. Sociological reflection is important for recognizing law, but it is insufficient for critiquing, for criticizing existing institutions. There is an explanatory value in Hart's description of the rules of conduct, primary rules, and a systematic modification recognized in adjudication. So there has to be not only just recognition, the social part of norms, what Hart talks about in concept of laws, but also how it can change, and that comes from aspiration and ethos. Hart is surely correct in that the rule of recognition identifies settled law and specifies the source of law as a relation to superior and subordination holding between them, which is necessary, as he says. But Hart's method is insufficient for looking outside of the status quo, what exists. That is to say, we have to recognize that law is not just, or constitutional law is not just what's captured by existing norms, and certainly not just by populism. You had Bolsonaro just recently in Brazil with this, but also by that which is the ideal of individual right protection and the benefit of the whole. And that is a matter of interpretation and reinterpretation. Put succinctly, put more briefly, the relevance of constitutional norms to specific circumstances involves more than Habermas's linguistic assessments and more than Hart's epistemic rules of recognition. Objectivity requires the interpretation of relevant constitutional texts to circumstances that are consistent with representative democracy. The greatest example of the Supreme Court doing this work was in Brown versus Board of Education, the very famous case that I think is known throughout the world, which ended public school segregation. But if you look at this case, Brown versus Board of Education, it only has to do with desegregation of schools, preventing racial discrimination in schools. But the court expanded what it said in Brown, which could have been read in a very, very narrow way, to all sorts of things, desegregation in everything from hospitals to telephone booths to restaurants and all sorts of things. And then Congress followed in order to prevent this through statutes and laws. Just as states' laws and community customs were not determinative, did not determine what the norms were, and otherwise Brown versus Board of Education could never have been decided. Neither should judicial opinions be the final points of objective reading. In the United States, and we have a very famous case called Dred Scott versus Sandiford, which was one of the most horrible cases in United States Supreme Court history. So in Brown, they did good, but judicial supremacy in Dred Scott created a situation where black African Americans could never be citizens in the United States. This is a case out of 1857, almost 100 years, 97 years before Brown versus Board of Education, that justified the South's exclusion of the South, exclusion of blacks in American society. So while states and the judiciary are important sources of normative discourse, they are not exclusive locations for its legitimacy and are also subject to criticism for where they fall short of impartial justice. Neither can text alone provide norms that are constant in constitutional ethos. This is very, very important. We have in the United States Supreme Court justices, most noticeably Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, who are textualists. They just say use text and it's going to be determinative. But contemporary constitutional meaning derives not just from text, but from a careful study of history, custom, tradition, doctrine, aspiration, mandate, and pragmatic outcomes. The indeterminacy is not a weakness, but a strength of democracy, leaving ample room for policy debates about a variety of legitimate alternatives for solving legitimate constitutional and legal puzzles. Norms of justice, equality, liberty, and human good keep the debate anchored to certain purposes of nationhood. Their ambiguity allows citizens to lobby for change or for things to remain the same in order to achieve improvement in social problems. To give an example from a general principle that government is created for the health and safety of citizens, which I think exists in every constitution I've ever read, for matters for preventing robbery, murder, manslaughter, and so on. Even these very, very specific provisions require lawyers, require conversation, require procedural justice in order to achieve the benefit of individuals for the greater good. Right? You could say something is a law of civil, is a civil law, criminal law, whatever you have, and justify all sorts of injustices without some sort of principle anchoring it. During the 20th century, legal realist scholars expressed skepticism about any such claim of a coherent, understandable legal meaning of ethos and principles. So legal realists believed that what was necessary was to watch what courts do rather than just what they say. Abstract legal principles, they believed, were indeterminate. You could not really figure out what they were too amorphous, and everything was done on the basis of what a judgment thought. There's a very famous thing out of Llewellyn that says, in order to determine what a judge will do, you have to determine what he eats in the morning. According to them, law is a system of social control with gaps and contradictions containing all manner of exceptions for almost every legal rule and principle, that there are tons of exceptions. They draw attention to how judges' backgrounds and quirks affect resolutions of cases. But again, going back to Fuller, demonstrated that positive legal norms are only part of the story. They don't explain the gaps in the law. They don't explain how to deal with contradictions. They don't advance methods for dealing with discrimination that exists in the law, for the subjectivity of judges, and for those that just plain disregard the law by using formalism or text in order to explain things that are expressly contrary to the principles and ideals, as was the case with Chief Justice Taney in his opinion in Dred Scott. Stable constitutional norms inform descriptive practice. They supersede existing customs where it falls outside of constitutional norms. The norms derive from specific written text, yes. That written text creates rights, interests, entitlements, but there's much more. The long settled view that the Constitution trumps other laws is not merely a social description, but also a norm with large scope of implications. It signals that there are certain principles that resonate throughout society, irrespective of what lesser laws local communities have adopted. Give me just a second here, shut down my phone. Lesser laws of local communities have adopted. 1 second. Of even higher order of priority are the equal dignity of humanity, and the establishment of institutions that benefit each member of a constitutional community. Thus, after the Civil War in the United States, the Reconstructionists were inspired by universal ideals to amend the Constitution, to end slavery, and to create birthright citizenship in order to live up to national ethos, thereby revoking those portions of the original document that were incompatible with it. In the U.S., feminists, abolitionists, manhood suffragists, labor organizers, and many others used the country's shortcomings to indict, to convict the politicians and social establishments, and to vindicate the rights in a complex society of equals. Inalienable rights, those that protect, that are asserted by the Declaration of Independence mandate, are not constructs of civil society. To the contrary, the reasons for creating complex legal order is to guarantee equal treatment of individuals, regardless of their status, their race, their ethnicity, their sex, their capabilities, their talents, their organizations. All of these are encompassed in human dignity. Objective value is not only an import of the framework for evaluating culture. Again, too technical. Objective value doesn't just come from looking at what exists in culture today or what's in society today. Rather, these are important for developing constitutional theory. The evaluation means unpacking text, breaking it down to explicit and implicit components, understanding its relation to society and history, drawing on values, applying federalist principles, right? That's something I have not mentioned, but it also has to do with how communities interact with each other, which is what I mean by federalist principles. How do small communities work together? How do they interact with larger units of states? How do they work outside of that framework to a national one? And how do they then interact on an international method such that we can have consistent and predictable interpretation? Objective value is not only an important framework for evaluating theory, but also for developing constitutional theory. The evaluation of a constitution requires these things. And so the fundamental rights framework can be interpreted as grounds in human nature and beneficent public policy rather than attitudes of judges and the leanings of legislatures. Moreover, such fundamental matters are more than mere procedural fairness, so more rich in substance than John Hart Ely acknowledged. So I want to stop there, and I thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I give many, many thanks today and for the rest of my life for this translation by Professors Melina and Rodrigo. Thank you so much for your time.
I'd like to thank you, Professor Alex. It was a pleasure to hear you and to see you again. And for us, it's a great opportunity to understand the ethos of the Constitution of the United States and even our ethos, of our Brazilian ethos of our Constitution. Maybe one day we can discuss in Brazil something like this, like a ethos, kind of a spirit of our Constitution. And I think, I hope so. I hope that's could be our future. But I'd like to.
That would be absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much even for that suggestion.
Thank you, Professor Alex. I'd like to thank you again, and it was a pleasure to hear you. And I don't know if you're open to discussing, but if you have a...
It's really an honor. I'm so grateful to you for spending the afternoon with me, and much more so I can not thank you enough for spending time with my thoughts.
Thank you again. And I speak in Portuguese now, Professor Tsesis. Sorry, because I have to.
I will do my best to understand.
Oh, okay, thank you.
I promise entirely.
Thank you very much. And sorry again.
Do you have time to answer a few questions, Alex?
Yes, I have a few minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Não, só queria agradecer também. Eu queria só para agradecer então a todos que estão aqui. Em primeiro lugar, eu cumprimento também o nosso presidente, o professor e presidente aqui desse Instituto dos Advogados, Dr. Guilherme Lucchesi, que é um prazer que esteja aqui, então agradeço bastante. Também cumprimento a desembargadora Rosana Fachin por estar essa noite aqui conosco. Então, muito obrigado por nos prestigiar. Ao Dr. Guido Dobeli, muito prazer também revê-lo. E quero nominar aqui a todos os, professora Vera, ao Dr. Paulo Salamunes, está aqui também, meu irmão Ricardo, Dr. Leonardo de Paola, agradeço, o Gabriel já acho que teve que sair também, teve que se ausentar, né, Dr. Leonardo, e a Ana Flávia Adas, também está conosco aqui, que também trabalha lá no escritório, e eu gostaria de agradecer nominalmente a todos os nossos coautores que trabalharam juntos e arduamente para que essa noite fosse possível. Então eu devo agradecer ao Amarildo, até pediu desculpa por não estar aqui, ele teve que fazer uma viagem, ele é de Ponta Grossa, então agradeço ao Amarildo publicamente, ao Bruno Meirinho, ao Danilo Arnaud, que hoje, Danilo não está, né? Não veio. Danilo, ao Gabriel Tomás, o Gustavo Scandelari não está aqui, mas está o Pedro aqui representando, agradeço também a presença, né, Pedro? Muito obrigado. Ao Hermínio, a Caroline, ao Luiz, a Mariana, tá? Mariana, muito obrigado. A Melina, Carla de Souza Brito, o Nicolai, que não está aqui também, a Olívia, a Renata e ao Thiago, que não está aqui, mas me mandou uma mensagem também agradecendo nesta semana. Então, eu só tenho a agradecer a todos pelo trabalho que é de vocês. Espero que possamos fazer mais, né, no futuro. Né? Muito obrigado a todos. Bom, eu vou passar a palavra para a professora Melina, então, que abrirá a discussão.
Ai, eu vou fechar aqui, senão vai dar.
Se você abrir o microfone, dá para ouvir daí.
Mas daí tem que fechar aquele, né?
Fecha aqui.
Para não dar. Alguém gostaria de fazer? Acho que não fechou.
Peraí. Não, aqui. Aqui, ó.
Não.
Não. Aqui, esse aqui é só para entrada.
Será que se eu falar agora?
Agora sim.
Alguém teria alguma pergunta, algum questionamento? Alex, we have one question. Posso tentar fazer o papel da tradutora e não traidora.
Pelos 9 juízes da corte, pela classe de professores e pela população como um todo. Né? Ou se há 2 planetas aí que não se conversam mais no que é acontecido no nosso país.
Você quer?
Pode fazer pergunta.
Faço aqui. Alex, we have a question from our audience by Dr. Leonardo. He asked if this ethos is shared by all the 9 justices of the Supreme Court and by also the law professors and thinkers and law community, if we do have a shared ethos or a shared idea of an ethos. Era mais ou menos isso. So I think I translated it right. I would also would like to enjoy the opportunity to pose you a question also, because I think even though the ethos idea was taught in the US constitutional tradition, I think we can use this idea in other contexts, and especially in a civil law context like ours, and with a very, very different constitutional model. But I would like to hear from you, because I think we have a very different look on the Constitution itself. In Brazil, I think we have the perspective that we are building a constitution and building our ethos. And in the US, I think you are, of course, you do have a living constitution idea, but it's like the ethos is the result of a process that started with the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution, and later the Bill of Rights. So my question is, can we have also not only a retrospective look on what the constitutional ethos is, but also a ongoing notion of the ethos? I think this would suit better for Brazilian constitutionalism.
So much. Let me, if I may, I'm going to start by answering Melina's answer, and then I'll go to Dr. Leonardo. I can see the audience. If Dr. Leonardo, if you could raise your hand, just so I know who asked.
Leonardo. He's there.
Okay, thank you. I think in many ways, thank you for focusing the camera on it.
Yeah.
I think in many ways Brazil might have the advantage. I apologize. I'm starting with Melina's question, but I will return to the first question. I think that it'll make most sense this way. I actually think that the methodology in a civil law country makes more sense for the development of constitutional ethos, because it allows for more players, more groups, more branches of government to identify and evolve the understanding of what the constitutional norms are, and much more importantly, how those norms have to be interpreted. Again, from everything from major issues, foreign policy or anti-discrimination policy throughout the country, to much more particular things, how to give the fair administration of criminal law, of cleaning the streets. I mean, it all comes in, right? How can we be fair in the administration of law just generally? Where it comes from a civil society, it's much more oriented to a development through legislative process that limits judges and even justices on the Supreme Court. Whereas in the United States, there's a tremendous limit because of the way that judicial supremacy has worked. And so I think, Melina, you're absolutely right. It's often not only tethered to a past, in many cases it's discriminatory and chauvinistic, but it's also tied in with the views of the individuals on the court. So we've seen this historical methodology. You mentioned living constitutionalism. Unfortunately, there's no one on the Supreme Court that talks about living constitutionalism. You would wish that were there, that we would talk about these principles in the Declaration and in the preamble, but talk about how they've evolved, how our understanding has evolved. Instead, we have an obfuscation, a hiding of this evolution through history and tradition. We've seen it most recently in Supreme Court cases, a case called Bruin, a case that expanded the right of people to hold guns under the Second Amendment to the Constitution. a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, where the court said it was using history and tradition, but seemed to eviscerate, to completely undo the separation between church and state. This is a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. And then with Dobbs, the case that undid the protection of a woman's right to privacy to make decisions about reproductive freedoms, where the court said we're just basing it on history and tradition, but it completely ignored an enormous amount of history and tradition and the evolution of culture. So it's wonderful, I think. It's not to let up Brazil off of, for historic injustices, but where there is an ability, a greater ability of people to influence the process through the civil society. And what Rodrigo mentioned, I would love to do that because I'd love to learn. And Rodrigo, is that your child there? Oh, how wonderful. My God, I remember before she was born. That's great that she's on stage with you. I would love to learn about how civil society about this evolution in Brazil. Going back to Dr. Leonardo's point about the ethos and justice, we don't have this. I'm not. Mine is an attempt to express an original point of view, which is a justification and a rationalization for developing a political theory of justice that is separate and apart from what the court is doing. More and more, I have an article coming out on this in Daedalus, an article that Jeff Stone and Lee Bollinger are editing for a collection for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences that tries to show the formalism on the court, this use of terminology of rights and justice for very almost what looks like politically driven agendas. So what I am expressing is an original theory that is not adopted, and I don't expect really anybody to adopt my point of view. That would be absolute nonsense. It's rather just trying to cast a seed onto legal and political thought to give rise to a development of a just society protective of individuals for the common good. And I'm so grateful that you in the audience and obviously for Professors Melina and Rodrigo to undertake this effort to rethink existing institutions and to go beyond linguistic norms, beyond social constructs, to think at a deeper level of the theory of justice, which really has to ground us in our development of the Constitution, regardless of what country we're in.
Do you?
Can you hear me? No. Hi, Alex. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, thank you for the lecture, and your book is such a great contribution to constitutional law. And Melina and Rodrigo's work on translation and the whole group is also a great contribution for Brazilian constitutional law. Alex, to what extent constitutional ethos, thought in terms of consensus and towards common good, cope with democratic ethos, thought in terms of conflict?
Thank you so much, Dean Vera. That's a critically important question. The idea is to have a common ground, a common wording, a common ideal to which people can refer in times of conflict. And maybe I'm too much of an optimist because I believe in the power of human rationalization. And I believe that if something is completely nonsensical, it does not abide by this principle that we must protect individuals for the common good, then we will see through it. It may not come immediately, and unfortunately, people may suffer during this interregnum of trying to evaluate how to resolve these conflicts. But if we can find a common ground that is to the common good, then I think that that's really essential. And it creates a standard, a flag towards which we can aspire. And I think that during times of hardship and oppression, it's really essential for hope, not only from a personal level, but from a societal level, that we can do better. And it also allows us to hold politicians accountable for where they fall short of I don't want to be repetitive, the ideals, the benefits for which the social contract has created.
Thank you, Alex. It was always a pleasure to hear and to learn from you. It was a pleasure to work with your book in our postgraduate program and to be able to translate your ideas for Portuguese in such an unequal society as the Brazilian, to think the constitutional ethos strong in equality and common good. It's very important. So thank you for having the time to be with us today. And if you allow me, I will close our panel in Portuguese. Agradecendo mais uma vez a todas e a todos que participaram não só do evento hoje, mas sobretudo do esforço coletivo, do pensar conjunto, da tradução de ideias e da comunhão de esforços para realmente pensar um direito constitucional que seja comprometido com uma igualdade plural, inclusiva, diversa e democrática, né, para a construção, efetivamente, dos objetivos constitucionais do artigo 3º, né, em que a ideia do bem comum lá aparece. Então, agradeço a todas e a todos. Mais uma vez, meu muito obrigada ao professor Rodrigo Kanayama, à Olivia Kanayama, pela sua presença ilustre no nosso evento hoje, que muito nos alegra. E ao Instituto dos Advogados, especialmente o esforço aí do nosso presidente que acabou de chegar do aeroporto e veio prestigiar o evento. Então, muitíssimo obrigada a todas e a todas. Thank you, Alex. Hope to see you soon. In November for sure. Bye-bye. Thank you.